This is Don Geiss, and this is the second in a series of videotapes we've been doing with outstanding people in the field of African violets. We want to remind our audience that these tapes are very informal. They're informal chats, and they are amateur tapes. We don't expect to compete with networks as far as polish is concerned, but we do want to bring to our audience, generally speaking, affiliated clubs with the African Violet Society of America. We want to bring them interesting anecdotes, tales of people who've had experience in the past. So with that introduction and the reminder of the amateur nature of the tape, in just a few seconds we'll bring you our interview. Hi, this is Don Geiss again, and today we're interviewing Jim Eyerdom, who at one time, until just a couple of years ago, was Granger Gardens in Medina, Ohio. And we wanted to talk to Jim about not only his experience with raising and hybridizing African violets, but his granddad Hugh and grandmother, who were active for many years in hybridizing and raising African violets. So Jim, let's start with your grandfather Hugh and grandmother Grace, and talk a little bit about what their experience was in raising African violets.
Okay. Yeah, the original plan of moving out to Granger from Cleveland, where they were originally from, was to grow vegetables and truck garden on the mucklands. It was the original ideas. Even building the greenhouse had nothing to do with African violets. The greenhouses were there to primarily start plants for putting down the vegetables, sort of growing them before they could be put out in the fields. And the greenhouses were built for that purposes. And then Grandma just one day brought home a violet from the store and wanted to go and just play around with that as a hobby, and asked Grandpa for a little bit of space in the greenhouse on it there. And from that's basically the beginning of Granger Gardens. It started out with Grandma's hobby. This started to take more of the greenhouse space, more and more of it, and it pretty much evolved in from there. But
well, you were telling me though that before we started that your grandmother really was the pusher of the whole idea of.
That's correct. Grandpa was the grower, I say, especially for the longest time. Even once the violet started, Grandpa was heavily involved still with because we still kept the produce end of the business going up into the mid 1970s. And Grandpa would be heavily involved with the produce, and his main role in the violets would be more in the hybridizing and growing, hybridizing, and working on gesneriids. Whereas Grandma was the one who really was the one who was out trying to find, going to different greenhouses all over the country at the time, bringing back new varieties and getting Granger Gardens involved in the African Violet Society, going to the conventions. Most of all, that would have been at the early stages. It was Grandma, and then with my mom and dad also going to the conventions or so on it there. But Grandma would probably, if you want to look at if we're talking about Grace and Hugh, Grandma was the one who was more involved in being with, like I say, in the AVSA end of the business. So Grandpa was more into the grower as far as, and Grandma was one of the hands-on running the business along with my dad.
Well, can you think of any of the plants that he hybridized?
Well, originally you had, going back, I'm a little foggy in my memory, going back into the early, it's a little before my time, going back into the 50s. Of some of the first thing they did, looking at some of just a few notes that Grandma had marked down from before about one of the early ones they had, Granger Gardens was famous for, was White Madonna, which was a white sport off of a blue they had picked up from one of their greenhouses or so. And there was quite a few of the varieties. I remember back, there was some of the first semi-doubles. They had a Lullaby, Fashion Air. Wonderland was one of the varieties that came out probably in the early 70s. It was one that was always on the top of the list as far as most popular varieties or so there. And then as we got into the early 70s, and Grandpa started to notice some of the mutations that led to the marketing of the chimeras or so, and that pretty much the Chimeras, and we introduced some of the varieties like Mauna Loa, those Valencia and Desert Dawn, and some of those varieties back in the late, just about the end, towards the end of the 1970s or so on those.
Somewhere along the line, I remember I had a plant, Moonbeam Sport. That was a Chimera
Right.
with a blue stripe on a
That's
white
correct.
background.
That was Moonbeams was very, very similar to the Valencia. Well, actually, the Moonbeams, there was another variety called Kilauea, which was the fantasy with the white stripes. And then once again, you can go round and round on what's a mutation of sport.
Really?
Yeah, the Moonbeams was a very similar color to the Kilauea, which was a fantasy with the white, but it was definitely a different cultivar, but it was very close. And then the Moonbeam Sport was when obviously fantasy varieties would often the blue would fill in, and the Moonbeam Sport was when the fantasy would fill in the blue, but the Chimera stripe would remain, so you would have the white with the blue coloring on it there.
I remember in one show that I got a blue ribbon of some sort because it was a sport, so it was put into the sport category, and it was really a Chimera.
Right. It was like I say, you can go round and round with what's a Chimera, a sport, or which is and that's almost another topic for another tape. But but they were awful good growing varieties. That was one of the things I enjoyed using those Chimeras that Grandpa had, was not so much only for the Chimera, but hybridizing them for the plant vigor, because they were exceptionally prolific blooming plants and nice shaping varieties. But the only drawback we had on it was that your best Chimeras came in as singles. Is if you start to go into semi-double or double them up, you'd lose a lot of the
primary color.
You would start to lose the nice definition in between the Chimeras, the Chimera colors. And so it was a trade-off. But the problem is, to get the best colors, you had a single, which would want to drop, especially going in the southern climates where they really would drop. And that was one of the hardest things of trying to find good semi-doubles that would hold the bloom but still keep the Chimera.
We sort of got off on a tangent there. At their peak, though, when Hugh and Grace were primarily responsible, how many plants did they have?
We had, I think, about the heaviest production we had. I mean, in other words, how many plants we would have on. Normally, if the greenhouse was full up, we could have up to 70,000 plants. I think the best years of sales we had back in probably in the mid 70s, we'd sell me about 140, almost 150,000 plants we'd sold. That was almost a peak back, and there was
annually.
Yeah, that was annually. That was a peak of. It was almost like a big plant boom back in the about 1976, 77. There was, and not only in violets but everything. There was just a big boom on with house plants and all. And that was the peak as far as selling, as far as quantity, production or so back then.
At some point, did Hugh give up the other farming in exchange for African violets?
Yes, back in about 19, we had, I say, continuing back to the other stories, and we were leading on about Grandma starting to take some of the greenhouse space off. During the greenhouses were constructed towards the late 1940s. And the original houses were some small houses that were torn down from somewhere else and rebuilt here. And the original purpose was for seedlings for the truck gardening. We had continued to build more greenhouses as we got more and more into violet business. However, the last greenhouses were primarily for greenhouse tomatoes. Those were built in the mid-50s. I think the last greenhouse was built in the 1960s. So we were half on African violets, half greenhouse tomatoes, running up into about 1973. And then at that time, and then we would run tomatoes in the summer, lettuce in the winter. The produce end of the business, we closed that out because the violets were beginning really coming on real heavy. The demand was very, very heavy for those in the early 70s. So by 1975, we had cut out all of the produce entirely. And once again, the produce was primarily a lot of where Grandpa spent a lot of his time in that. And then that's when he spent probably quite a bit more time swinging over into working on the Chimeras and Gesneriids back in the early, I was about 1975, 76, and then, because I say about 3 or 4 years later, the Chimeras came out.
Well, someplace in that time, your father, Dale, came into the picture.
Well, actually, yeah, that was, actually both my mom and dad, when they got married in the late 40s, they both came in the business. So Ma would work out in the greenhouse too. So basically, that you look at, you probably had the amount of work pretty well distributed between Grandma and Grandpa and Mom and Dad, going from the late 40s into the early, going into the 70s or so on out there. So you had, I say, each person had a specific role in the business or so out there. Grandpa doing his growing and hybridizing, Dad running the business, Mom working on some of they had the retail and doing quite a bit of the book work, and then Grandma being involved very heavily in, I say, with pretty much quite a range of the operations or so on out there, quite a bit of the management, and a lot of the work involved with the with Granger Gardens affiliation with the African Violet Society during those years or so.
Tough for me to picture 150,000 plants going out of it.
Yeah, there was a lot of, because we only really had about a third of an acre of production. It's about 13,000 square foot was what we had in violet production or so on out there. And you'd have a heavy spring season, and you can usually roll the crop over twice a year or so. So we had the heavy spring rush, which was February through May. The summer and midwinter were really slow, and so there'd be the heavy spring season, and there was the secondary fall season or so.
How many greenhouses were involved?
We had about 12, 12 or 13. It's a little deceiving because some were larger, some were small on it there. The greenhouses were, it was a situation of, things were built as they could be afforded back in the 40s and 50s, so they just sort of kept on tacked down the hill. Some a little smaller, some a little larger, and they sort of went down the hillside and used the topography of the land.
Now, I remember you're saying that it was in the 40s that the greenhouses were re-erected.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
That's interesting because in doing the interview with the Tenaries, Frank mentioned the fact that that was the only way they could get a greenhouse, was get a used one, tear it down, and put it back up.
That's correct, because the thing is, greenhouses in effect are sort of like giant tinker toys, and the fact is they're sort of bolted together, or pull the nails out, and the whole things can come down, be taken away, picked up, and in their entirety re-erected or so. And that was a very common form for people to get into the business, especially like with the, I imagine some of the Tenaries timeline probably runs fairly close to what Grandma and Grandpa's was, and our Granger Gardens along the same line. And as nobody was operating from probably heavy cash levels back then, and that was pretty much a very common way of everything was done. Not only by ourselves, but in the greenhouse business, when somebody had a place to tear down, it was very common when you knew about it, because you could build something for a small fraction of what, if you compared to what you'd have to buy new materials for.
Well, Frank seemed to indicate that because of the war,
mm-hmm.
They weren't producing any new greenhouses.
Frank's would probably be a little bit earlier on, because if he's talking in the 40s, because I think our greenhouses were mostly rebuilt. Some of these things were, I think the original greenhouses that we still have, the ones that were standing out here, the first ones were built in the early 1900s, maybe 1920s, and then they were bought and rebuilt. I mean, were bought, torn down. I think they picked them up somewhere in southern Ohio or so, and brought them back and rebuilt them. That was in the late 40s, but it was just basically the matter that, that just capital was just sort of hard to come by back in the, in the late 40s, early 50s or so for starting in on the type of business. So, but I would think that if Frank was with Frank's was probably a little earlier, being if it was during the wartime or so, because this was definitely in the late 40s when they started doing some of the stuff here or so.
Well, now, you mentioned earlier that Grace got involved with the African Violet Society of America.
Mm-hmm.
Was this a pretty big deal in at that particular point?
Like I say, it was during its formative years. I think that was when the AVSA was growing up, and that's where Grandma was involved very heavily back with the AVSA at that time. Like I say, it is before my time to get a clear recollection, but I know that when it came to going to the conventions and stuff, that's where I say Dad and Grandpa not so much going, but my mom would be involved, and then Grandma specifically going to the conventions or so on there and being involved with the AVSA organization back in during those years or so there. And
okay.
That was,
Now, where did you take over?
I graduated from high school in 1973 and came into the business or so. And it worked well, because that was when the violets were coming on a big plantings and everything. There was I remember the production. We went from like maybe growing 70 to 90,000 plants in 1973, and by 1976, 77, it was up to 140, 150,000. So there was a big push. It was a big expansion of the business. So that's where I came in, and we had discontinued the tomatoes during that time or so. So I would sort of work as sort of, like I say, Dad's assistant on there during that time. And Grandma was not as involved much as in the day-to-day operations, but she was still doing quite a bit of the bookkeeping, and still some of the stuff with the AVSA during the mid 70s, and that's where Grandpa was really going in heavily then with his research on the chimeras, and he was still doing quite a bit of work also with the Gesneriids at that time, and still his hybridizing, the hybridizing of the standard varieties also was going in full swing or so during that area there. And
well,
then,
I suspect as they passed away, but slowly but surely the whole burden fell on your shoulders.
well, actually, Grandma and Grandpa, they well into their 80s, Grandpa was still helping me. I say Grandpa passed away in 1992, and he was, I believe, 88, and even up to a few years before that time, he was still actively doing work and helping me with the hybridizing on that time. Grandma would be assisting both of us. Dad passed away in 1983, and at that time we reorganized the business, and Grandma and Grandpa, someone went into semi-retirement, but Grandpa still was very active in working for me, or not working for me, but assisting me and helping with a lot of the hybridizing still for quite a few years after that. During that time,
that's true dedication.
Yeah, exactly, because he was doing it as not as an employee, but it was working for free for me, helping me out on everything for quite a few years on that there. Then Grandma was also assisting that time. Then in 1983, when Dad had passed away, Ma still worked was for quite a few years, did the bookkeeping, and then my wife came in at that time, and so she helped with. She slowly took over the bookkeeping and also in some of the day-to-day operations when it came to along with the other our other employees or so, with packing the plants and doing whatever packing for shipping, potting, and whatever so on there.
Well, do I recall you were in service?
No, I never was in the service, so I just went over on Japan as a visit. We had one account at that time. There was some accounts in Japan who were interested in African violets.
Wow.
There was a thing, especially with the chimeras. There was a plant boom going in Japan in the early 1980s that never really quite took off on it there, and there was some interest from a couple different parties there about having violets imported along with the chimeras or so. And we had an affiliation with one client over there. And at that time I went over there and I was on vacation in Japan when I met my wife. That was in the early 1980s or so.
Oh, that's interesting because your experience there sort of paralleled Ralph Robinson, Rob.
Exactly, right.
In meeting a gal in Taiwan.
Right, okay. Yeah, because but yeah, and then we continued the business, and my wife and I, and then my ma still had quite a bit of assistance, and then Grandpa and Grandma still, were putting in quite a bit of help and time, really, as long as they were physically able or so, and then I think it was 1995 that we made the decision to terminate operations or so on there. So I think it was 1996 is when we finally.
Was it that long ago?
That's been almost over 4 years, because it's been over 4 years now. Amazingly.
That's what happened.
Time marches on.
It seems like yesterday that.
Yeah, that's exactly.
We got the notice. Well, while you were in operation, you did quite a bit of hybridizing too.
Yes, because as I say, as Grandpa was doing some, and I was sort of swinging into it or so on there, but as my feelings on the hybridization, I was more of a seed crosser, whereas Grandpa's expertise on it was being a true hybridizer, actually understanding the genetics a lot of, much more of where I was involved with or so. And basically, I was just pretty much riding on Grandpa's coattails.
What do you mean by seed crosser?
Well, I mean, my approach toward the hybridization was looking at the plants and seeing good traits in this variety and seeing other traits in this, you could look and see this may be something that would go together. I think Grandpa's expertise in the field was, having a much greater knowledge of genetics and knowing exactly what he was, especially the work he was doing with the with the chimeras and work along that lines there.
What about the fantasies? Didn't you have some
Fantasies, actually, I don't know if we were involved heavily. Actually, I probably went in a little more with the fantasy varieties. I do believe that the fantasy varieties that we got in were something, most of the varieties that we grew on were that some material we brought in from someone else and then worked, hybridizing on it there. In a lot of cases, a hybridizer is only good as the person whose material they are hybridizing off of there. That's what I was saying, riding in the coattails. That's very common. You can go and take and go around to some of the major hybridizers and get some of their best material, and you can get a lot of mileage off of all the expertise they've done before. And that was the case like with Granger Gardens with all the foundation that Grandpa had set up there. It's the same thing if you go with with a lot of other things. With the type of varieties that Rob's turns out with Lions and a lot of Pittman's. Just to name a few. All the folks who have throughout the years have created these things. There's a lot of good genetics that that have been. There's been a strong foundation have been put in by these folks, and that was where my feeling was as far as what I was working with Grandpa's stuff on there. But as far as the fantasy varieties, I liked them from a purely business or a pure a business point of view. In fact, it was something that was different than you'd find in the normal dime store violets. I thought there was a lot of demand for them there. However, from a hybridizer's point of view, they're a nightmare because they're so unstable and they're very, very difficult. And one of the problems is it's just the varieties you could not sell when if you're a hybridizer and selling leaves, you're going to have a lot of upset customers because you couldn't sell them from leaves. Most of our business was going in the finished plant category where we would sell things for resale for shows and whatnot, and the chimeras were fine. But we ended up with an awful lot of solid color blues and off color blues and things because you would get with the if you're lucky you'd get at least 20 or 30% going solid blue or even more from that.
I've had some experience along those lines.
Exactly, and the thing is it worked good for us because we would have other customers who needed things for European gardens, dish gardens that would just take any color of varieties of flowers, and then we could use the solid color plants for those. But that is one of the problems with the fantasy varieties. They are attractive and they are good, nicely marketable plants, but the genetics of them leave a lot to be desired because it's very, very difficult to find something that's going to be anywhere close to being true on those there.
Well, now, did you have some commercial customers, some large commercial customers?
Yes, as far as we had, that was one of the things that actually made our business sort of difficult towards the end, is to try to put a price that would match all of our different type of customer base. We had retail customers who would come in. We had AVSA type of customers and AVSA commercials, and then we were also large enough where we were also in the commercial business where we were into the mass marketing arena also. And because of the wide range of markets, you have different prices on there, and it was very difficult to put pricing that would span across all of them or so out there.
Well, out of curiosity, what would be a large commercial order?
For us, we would have sometime we would maybe sell 500, 600, 700 plants, or 1,000, 2,000 at a time to someone for some growing on orders or so on out there, to the large commercial places. But when it comes to, if you talk to the other large commercial growers or so, that's a drop in the bucket, because you look at the big competitors in that industry, they're selling things by the tens of thousands to people or so on.
I was just going to say, out of curiosity, I wonder how many plants, let's say Walmart would order.
It's unbelievable when you look at when you're big, large mass marketers, and that was one of the problems that we faced as one of the decisions that we were looking at, because if you go into marketing and you find one of the most difficult things you don't want to do is get caught trying to be in two different in getting caught between different markets, and that was one of the problems we had, is that if we were a little smaller we could have totally stayed into the AVSA type of collector market, but the trouble is we were a little bigger, so we had to also go into the mass marketing end, and that's a much more price sensitive market on that or so, and it's a difficult thing when you try to start try to grow for all different marketplaces on there.
Uh, just thinking of it in terms of AVSA buyers, excuse me, are they the majority? Were they the majority buyers out of the greenhouses?
Back in the, I would say back in the, that was one of the transitions with the business. Back when I came in the 70s, you would find that being the case with you know, a lot of our commercials. So we had this is the one thing, there was like two different commercial type customers. We figured there was the AVSA type of commercial customer who would, and those were a lot of fairly large accounts, and there was the commercials that had nothing to do with AVSA, which would be something with a garden center or something like that. And a lot of our earlier accounts were more towards the AVSA type of commercial accounts that were back, and a lot of those dissipated off. There was a very strong amount of those. There was a very strong market of that back in the late 70s, early 80s, because a lot of commercials, a lot of people were hobbyists, would also be commercials on the side, sell plants out of their house and whatnot. And slowly over the years, the marketplace changed, and a lot of our commercial business on that end sort of just kept on going down and down or so out there. And that was once again, that in the older times, that was a very strong market for us there. But unfortunately, that market had decreased over time on it there.
Now, I don't want to be nosy.
No problem.
And tell me if I'm asking the wrong question, but why did you close?
There was that's a good question, because a lot of people have asked that, and there was a lot of small things that added up. And as I had mentioned before, one of the things was the change of the demographics in the marketplace. And as I mentioned before, the AVSA customers were the AVSA commercials, which had been a lot of our bread and butter of our customer base, had been going down and down. And if we were going to stay in business, we'd have to get into larger, more of a mass production. And that is such a price-sensitive marketplace. You're growing the price pressures on that, make it very, very difficult to compete with the larger mass-marketed growers who are more they have a much better layout, and you really can't compete with some of the larger places when when they have everything automated and they've got their whole greenhouse set up for it. That leads into, you know, the greenhouse as we had it. It was mostly built in from the 1950s through the 1960s. We really didn't have, you had a greenhouse that was basically 30, 40, 50 years old, and if I was going to modernize it, it was going to be a very cost-intensive operation to do, and it was sort of being at a crossroads with a lot of situations. I was 40 years old, and I says, well, I'm either going to put a lot of money into this business here, and not knowing where the marketplace was, because it seemed the mass marketing, there was still a lot of price pressures. We were getting, if you look back in the 1950s and early in the late 1960s, some of the new varieties, when they'd come out on the market, retailed be $4. But we look now, if you go in the chains and the discount stores, you're still seeing, you know, 99 cents, $1.49, and $2 violets. And especially with everything else going up, it just there wasn't a whole lot of room to raise the price of the product up with the cost of living going up or so on there.
That mass market must sell awfully cheap per plant.
Well, it is, but the idea is, it's like anything else. It's, you know, it's with everything else that sells in your, you know, with the Walmarts and the Kmarts compared to, and we were sort of it was the old mom and pop type of operation there. And you look what happens all across America is, if you're selling in large quantities, you can afford to sell large amounts of things at a lower price. As long as you're selling a lot of material, you can make it with smaller margins or so. And that's, if you look at the large competitors on that, they have to grow a lot of, they're selling a lot of merchandise or so. And so that's the thing is, we weren't quite equipped to be competitive in that marketplace. And unfortunately, our customer base in the AVSA type of commercials had gone down with the demographics of the way things had changed or so, because you don't find compared to the kind of customers we had back in the 70s and early 80s, you don't see a lot of Mary's Plant Shop where AVSA hobbyists could hang their shingle out front and sell some of their plants out to the public. And there was, because we had a lot of customers who were still doing it back in that time, and there's not a whole lot of those anymore.
Yeah. Well, I think I could speak for any number of our ABSA members in saying that we remember Ranger Gardens and we miss them.
Well, thank you. Yeah, and that was the same thing. It goes back to our customers. I was just had a lady had called the other day. Joe Wells from New York was calling them just to stop in and give me a call and say hello. And that was the one thing that I had apologized for being remiss, because it was, if people have asked, well, do you miss the business? And a lot of the hassle, fighting the bugs and fighting the weather and shipping, those things I don't miss. But the one thing I do miss is all the folks that we had met all through the years, like Don and all of our customers, because it was a very pleasant group of people to work with. I say we made a lot of friendships over the years, and unfortunately, with the closing the business and not being, in touch with those folks day to day, a lot of those friendships, unfortunately, I haven't followed up as well as I do, and I do apologize for that for
a lot of your friends
folks we met there.
A lot of your friends would probably like to know what you're doing now.
The summer we closed the business up, I had a call from our plastic supplier, who we bought our plastics for, and they said, well, I was going back to school at that time or so, because I'd turned 40, I decided to go back to college, which hadn't gone out of high school, and so I started to go back to school, and he says, well, while you're going to school, do you want to drive for us 2 days a week? Well, that was about the month we closed the greenhouse, and I started working full-time for that company by the fall of 1996, and so I've been working for a company called Cleveland Floral Products, and primarily we sell plastic pots and plastic containers, and then also we work with one other company selling a full line of greenhouse supplies and materials or so. And then, like I say, so I'm pretty much do a little bit of anything with the present company I was in. Sometimes I'm on the road, other times working in the office, because we broker plant material for greenhouses, selling, I say, soil and just so it's a little bit of soup to nuts as far as the work I'm involved in right now. And I do enjoy it because I'm involved with some of the same people, some of the larger commercials that we were involved with in the industry, and I'm still working with the same people, and it's sort of a swing off it's off into the same business I was in or so. And so it's sort of and the one thing I do, it is interesting looking at the changes from running a business to working for someone. A lot of people just don't realize running a business how easy it is working for someone and going home at night on a Friday night and not having to worry about what's all going on over the weekend. And because I think anybody who's there who had a greenhouse or so like this, and I know when it went for my grandmas and grandparents and parents, and I think it was a 7 day a week job, and it basically never ended. And then, like I say, when working for somebody else, suddenly at Friday evening at 5 o'clock, as long as everything was done right, your work is sort of out of sight, out of mind until Monday morning. But that was never the case back when you were working in your own business.
I'm sure. Well, Jim, let's let that be the last word. And we've been speaking with Jim Eyerdom, part of 3 generations of Eyerdom, including Hugh and Dale, who have raised African violets, hybridized, just about handled anything in the field. And Jim, as I mentioned earlier, we miss you.
Thank you, sir. I miss all the folks in the industry.